On April 9th, something locked into place between Ottawa and Washington that, if you truly understand the mechanics of global power, marks the definitive beginning of a completely different North American era. This was not a routine trade spat. This was not diplomatic theater designed for the evening news. This was a coordinated, precision-timed and politically devastating answer from Canada to the one pressure point Donald Trump and the people around him assumed would never be used against them this aggressively, this publicly, and this fast. You need to sit up and understand the weight of what is unfolding right now because it represents the first time in modern North American politics that Canada has signaled in unmistakable terms that it is prepared to turn economic interdependence into a strategic weapon against Washington itself. This is not speculation, it is not a rumor, and it is certainly not clickbait. This is a civilization-defining warning shot about what happens when one ally decides the old rules no longer protect its interests. Subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications because the next 72 hours could determine whether this becomes a contained confrontation or the beginning of a much wider economic and political rupture that changes your life. Most people still think of Canada as polite, cautious, incremental, and predictable. That is exactly why this hits so hard. Because when a government with a reputation for extreme restraint starts moving with this kind of terrifying speed publicly across multiple pressure points, simultaneously the message is no longer symbolic, it is purely strategic, and when strategy replaces symbolism, outcomes stop being emotional and start becoming mechanical. That is when consequences become inevitable. So let's rewind the clock and trace exactly how we got here, because the build-up to April 9th was not improvised. It was deliberate, it was layered, and it was designed specifically to land where it would hurt the most. On February 1st, Trump signed executive orders imposing 25% tariffs on all Canadian goods except energy, which got 10%, invoking the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. The assumption in Washington's political orbit was clear. Canada would complain loudly, issue a stern statement, maybe float a retaliatory tariff list, and then ultimately look for an off-ramp. That assumption was the first catastrophic mistake. By early March, phones were ringing across the Canadian cabinet. Trade teams, provincial offices, and industry groups tied to autos, energy, aluminum, potash, critical minerals, cross-border freight, and defense procurement were all pulled into the loop. Not one sector, not to a matrix. And here is the detail that should terrify anyone in Washington who thought this was just about headlines. The response was not being designed around what would sound strong on television. Prime Minister Mark Carney stated this explicitly. Canada's countermeasures, he said, were designed to, and I'm paraphrasing his public statement, maximize us consequences while minimizing domestic fallout. That is a completely different level of thinking. By March 13th, Canada had already imposed 25% reciprocal tariffs on $12.6 billion in US steel products, $3 billion in aluminum products, and an additional $14.2 billion in other U.S. goods, a total of $29.8 billion Canadian, dollar for dollar matching Washington's steel and aluminum levies. The temperature was rising. Publicly, Carney's language remained measured, but privately, the posture had already hardened. Canada was not asking, how do we protest? Canada was asking, where exactly is the leverage, how fast can it be applied, and how visible can the pain become before Washington is forced to recalculate? That is not diplomacy. As usual, that is retaliation architecture. Then came April 2nd, and this is where it gets serious. Trump's so-called Liberation Day tariffs landed, and Canada was specifically spared the new across-the-board reciprocal tariff wave applied to dozens of other countries. But the 25% Section 232 tariffs on autos and auto parts went into effect at midnight. Carney went on camera and called it plainly. The era of close economic integration with the United States, he said, has ended. By April 9th, Canada's full retaliatory auto tariffs were live. The realization landed in full. Canada was no longer signaling displeasure. Canada was demonstrating that it knew exactly where the U.S. political machine is soft. Hit that like button right now if this is making sense so far, because the most explosive part is coming next. These confrontations are never really about the press release. They are about the room where the decision gets made, the room where people stop thinking about optics and start thinking about survivability. When Carney met with his cabinet, his premiers, and his trade teams in the days around April 2nd and 3rd, the question on the table was not, how do we sound tough? The question was, if Washington wants pain, where do we deliver it so precisely that the people cheering today begin panicking tomorrow? The answer Carney gave publicly was unambiguous. Canada's countermeasures, he said, were about targeting every single dollar raised directly back at protecting Canadian workers. But the subtext, which every analyst, every CFO, and every supply chain manager understood immediately, was something colder. If Washington wants to turn dependency into a weapon, Canada must stop pretending it isn't holding one too. That line, spoken not in a dramatized war room, but in actual press conferences and parliamentary addresses, changed the tone of the entire confrontation across the border. While allies of Trump were framing the confrontation as proof of strength, a hidden danger was already building. While one side celebrated the headline, the other side studied the circuitry. While one side performed dominance, the other side mapped consequences. While Washington talked, Ottawa counted. Nobody saw that shift coming, or rather, nobody who mattered on the U.S. political side wanted to believe it was happening. Let's look at the receipts, starting with receipt number 1. The supply chain. Modern North American manufacturing is not national in the old sense. It is integrated, layered, timed to the hour, and terrifyingly vulnerable to friction. A single automotive component can cross the border multiple times before a finished vehicle rolls off a line. Canada's April 9 auto tariffs, 25% on non-CUSMA compliant fully assembled US vehicles, were engineered precisely around this reality. When border certainty collapses, costs do not rise. Gradually, they spike, they cascade, and they obliterate planning assumptions. This is industry code for one thing. Even small retaliatory moves, if targeted correctly, can produce outsized pain in exactly the regions political strategists least want destabilized. Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, the same districts Trump cannot afford to lose. Then we have receipt number 2, energy and raw materials. Think of it like an electrical grid. You don't have to destroy the whole system to create a blackout. You only have to stress the right junctions. Canada sits on junctions that matter: oil flows, electricity interconnections, uranium, potash, nickel, cobalt, and rare mineral processing. Canada supplies approximately 60% of US uranium imports. It is the single largest foreign supplier of steel and aluminum to American manufacturers. If reviews, delays, or compliance actions start touching even a fraction of those channels, the effect hits utilities, fertilizer costs, and construction timelines. Immediately, Ontario Premier Doug Ford made this leverage explicit, briefly imposing a 25% surcharge on electricity flowing to 1.5 million US homes before suspending it. The message was received. When inflation anxiety returns, political narratives begin to collapse. Receipt number 3 involves procurement and institutional trust. This is not just about goods crossing a border. It is about whether Canada continues treating US access as automatic in areas where legal discretion exists. We are talking about defense contracts, infrastructure bids, and technology partnerships when a close ally, one whose government has filed formal WTO dispute consultations against Washington twice in the space of weeks, starts treating access as conditional rather than automatic. The damage is not only financial, it is reputational. It tells the world that dealing with Washington now carries a political risk that must be priced in. Canada filed its first WTO dispute consultation on US steel and aluminum tariffs in March. It filed a second one over auto tariffs in April. That is not theater, that is institutional architecture being built around a long confrontation. Finally, receipt number 4, the markets. Even before laws change, markets smell risk. The minute cross-border escalation looks durable instead of theatrical, traders begin repricing everything from autos to agriculture. Analysts issue notes, CFOs call emergency meetings, and hedging costs rise. Nobody needs a formal rupture for the economic damage to begin. The anticipation alone can do it. By early April, the S&P 500 had briefly neared bear market territory, closing almost 19% below its February record high as optimism faded for any rapid resolution to the tariff war. This is how a political gambit becomes a balance sheet event within hours. Drop a comment right now if you saw this coming, because I'm telling you, most of Washington did not. Systems do not move themselves. People move them, ego moves them, fear moves them, and memory moves them. Donald Trump's public image has always been built around projection. Pressure hard, dominate the frame, and force the weaker side to blink first. He believes hesitation is weakness and that retaliation is often more theatrical than real. That instinct has worked for him in business and in media, but it creates a dangerous overconfidence when facing an opponent whose reputation suggests caution. If you assume the other side is psychologically incapable of escalation, you stop seeing the board clearly, and that brings us to the Canadian side. Mark Carney is Not acting like a man trying to win applause, he is acting like a man trying to prove a doctrine that middle powers do not survive by sounding offended. They survive by identifying leverage and showing they are willing to use it publicly. He ran an entire federal election on this exact promise and won on April 28 with it. Carney spent decades at the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. He studies pressure with a microscope. He remembers every slight and every tariff threat, and strategy built on institutional memory is usually colder than strategy built on anger. There is always one defining moment in confrontations like this, not on camera, but in the private language of seriousness. That moment comes when a leader asks a brutally simple question: if we do not answer now, when exactly do we answer? That is the line, that is the hinge. Once a government concludes that non-response guarantees future coercion, retaliation stops being risky and starts looking necessary. The question is no longer if, but when, and once that switch flips, the countdown begins. This isn't just about one man or one government, it's about the architecture of the alliance itself. For decades, the relationship functioned on an unspoken assumption that asymmetry would be tolerated because interdependence created mutual restraint. But if one side starts treating interdependence as a weapon, the other side eventually learns the same language, not because it wants to, but because it has to. When that happens, the old moral authority collapses, trust evaporates, and the stabilizing fiction shatters. This is where it gets terrifying for ordinary people. If you work in manufacturing, transportation, agriculture, or retail, your costs are exposed. If you live in Michigan, Ontario, New York, Quebec, Pennsylvania, Alberta, or Ohio, your local economy is exposed. If you have a retirement account loaded with industrials or logistics, your savings are exposed. If you care about inflation, your household budget is exposed. Personal, community, national, and global. That is how these things move. Here is the domino chain. First comes rhetoric, then compliance reviews, then delivery uncertainty, then input costs rise, then firms delay expansion, and then hiring softens. Finally, allies begin to ask whether US access is still worth the volatility, and international competitors move in. The damage becomes harder to reverse than the politicians who triggered it ever imagined. This is the mechanical inevitability of poorly managed interdependence. Pause and hit that like button if this blows your mind, because we are still not at the deepest layer. The deepest layer is legitimacy. This isn't just about tariffs or trucks. It's about whether the United States can still treat alliance relationships as one-way instruments without provoking organized resistance from countries that have spent years learning exactly how dependent the American system is on its neighbors. This is about whether Canada has now shown a blueprint for how a smaller ally can force a larger power to feel consequences where it actually counts, not with military drama, but with paperwork, timing, supply chains, and legal discretion. If that doctrine spreads, the implications are seismic. Europe, Asia, and Mexico are all watching. Everyone is asking the same question. If Washington makes unpredictability permanent, can smart allies learn to price that unpredictability back into America? If the answer is yes, then the story is bigger than any one leader. It becomes a story about the slow reshaping of the Western order itself. Nobody wins easily here. Canada bleeds too, and that is what makes this credible. Pain that costs nothing is theater. Pain that carries domestic risk is policy. So where does this end? I see two paths and absolutely no middle ground. Path one is difficult, disciplined, and still possible. Cooler heads step in, private channels deepen, rhetoric softens. Temporary measures are frozen before they harden into doctrine. Business leaders, governors, premiers, and labor groups all begin screaming the same message at once. Stop now before the damage becomes self-sustaining. This is the hopeful path, but it requires an acknowledgement that strength sometimes means de-escalation. Path 2 is the catastrophic path, and it is looking more likely by the hour. In this scenario, the retaliatory cycle widens. Each side convinces itself the other will crack first. New restrictions trigger counter-restrictions. Border friction increases and compliance burdens multiply. Market volatility spills into consumer anxiety, which spills into political anger. Harder rhetoric kills off any chance of compromise. Allies lose trust. Investment relocates and supply chains are redesigned specifically to avoid U.S. predictability. Nobody wins, everyone bleeds, and the old continental bargain finally dies. I believe we are much closer to path 2 than the television panels want to admit. These moments can turn fast. A single phone call can calm a market, but a single sentence can ignite one. That is how fragile the machinery is right now. And once public trust in the relationship collapses, even a formal resolution doesn't restore what was lost overnight. You can sign a document, but you cannot sign away the memory of a threat. The US-Canada relationship will never be exactly the same after a moment like this. Even if the immediate confrontation cools tomorrow morning, the trust is fractured and the illusion is gone. You simply cannot unring that bell. Canada didn't just answer pressure. It showed the world a blueprint for how a smaller, integrated ally can fight back against a larger power by weaponizing precision instead of volume and leverage instead of rage. This institutional discipline is a lesson that will not be forgotten by other nations watching from the sidelines. The question now is whether Washington learns anything from this before the costs become irreversible. When you look at the sheer scale of the integrated economy, the stakes are almost too high to calculate. We are talking about $2.5 billion USD in goods and services crossing that border every single day, a number the Canadian government itself has put on the record. If that assumption of a friendly open border is replaced by a check the paperwork mentality, the friction alone will act as a permanent tax on North American prosperity. I'm not optimistic, but I've been wrong before. We have to look at the long-term shift in how middle powers interact with superpowers in a multipolar world. The era of automatic compliance is ending, replaced by a transactional reality where every move is met with a counter-move. For the average person, this means the prices you pay at the grocery store or the gas station are now tied to high-stakes diplomatic poker games. It means the stability of your job in a manufacturing plant or a logistics firm depends on whether the relationship holds or explodes. This is the reality of the new North American era, one where silence is often more dangerous than a shout, and where the most important maps aren't of territory, but of supply chain dependencies. We are witnessing the dismantling of decades of trust in real time, and the reconstruction will take much longer than the destruction did. What do you think? Is Canada defending its sovereignty or gambling with continental stability? Is Trump projecting strength or walking straight into a trap built out of the very interdependence he assumed guaranteed compliance? And the biggest question of all, when allies stop trusting the center of power, what happens to the entire system built around that trust? This is a fundamental shift in the global order, and it's happening right in our backyard. Drop your answer in the comments because I read every single one. Subscribe if you haven't already, because the next market open, the next policy announcement, and the next 24 hours of cross-border signaling could change this story immediately. The story isn't slowing down. The consequences are compounding by the second. Don't look away, because this is the moment the world changed, and most people are still asleep. Stay tuned as we continue to track every move in this high-stakes game of economic chess.